The British Empire, which started to become more stable around the world in the 1600s, was once the biggest empire in the world. Once a superpower that was always present, it became a thing of the past after Hong Kong was handed over in July 1997. Many of the pages of history lavishly describe the heroic and civilized tasks it carried out around the world when it was at the height of its power. The truth is not as simple as that. Yes, the British Empire ended slavery before some of its foes, like the newly formed United States, but they did it while making sure that more than 40,000 slave owners got paid. Yes, the British government banned the Hindu practice of Sati in India in 1829. Sati means burning widows while they sit on top of their husbands' funeral pyres. This took away valuable resources from the area for the Crown's benefit and left it open to the terrible famine of 1876 to 1878 that killed millions. People often believe that the British Empire was kind and helpful everywhere it went. This idea needs to be looked at closely and busted as soon as possible. It was a cruel and huge empire, just like every other one that has ever existed, as its long and bloody past has shown century after century. The British Empire's past is a mess. They put down many revolts in their colonies by using brutal methods. They attacked people's very cultural identity, and they didn't do much to help with the famines that happened in the areas they controlled. The suppression of the Irish language under British rule. With roots going back to at least the 5th century, the Irish language is one of the oldest in the world. Unfortunately, there are fewer and fewer people who can speak Irish fluently. The 2022 Irish census found that only 10% of the country's over 2 million speakers were confident in their ability to claim proficiency. It is clear that British rule over the Emerald Isle is directly responsible for the sad decline of such an old language. Even though England officially took over Ireland in 1541, the Irish language had been banned for hundreds of years before that. The famous Statute of Kilkenny was made law by Prince Lionel, who was the son of Edward III. It said that Anglo-Saxon settlers could not speak Irish, and made many other rules that treated every part of Irish culture as a disease that needed to be controlled. After 400 years, when Britain was the most important country in the world, Ireland passed the Administration of Justice Language Act, which made it illegal to speak any language other than English in court. In the early 1900s, just giving money to schools to teach Irish was seen as an attack on unionist values and seen as patriotic. When the Easter Rising failed in 1916, and Ian McNeill, the chief of staff of the Irish Volunteers and a scholar whose life and work were mostly devoted to the Irish language, was arrested several times, the British government made sure to take away his research on language and history. Simply put, the British Empire has always seen the Irish language as a danger, and we can still see the effects of that today. Britain failed to reduce Irish potato famine suffering. From 1845 to 1852, the Irish potato famine happened. Phytophthora infestans, a mold, destroyed the area's most important crop. About 1 million people died of sickness and hunger, and millions more ran away. Even though the British Empire wasn't directly to blame for the disaster that hit the land, the policies of the empire didn't do much to help the Irish people who were struggling. There was a terrible disease going through Ireland at the same time that huge amounts of food and grain were being sent to England. Another thing that made things worse was the way Irish society was set up at the time, which was done by the British. In Ireland, the wealthy people who owned land were mostly Anglo-Irish landlords who ran their estates from away and didn't pay much attention to them. A lot of people went hungry because of this, which caused a lot of paperwork problems. Who was responsible for helping the Irish people, the British Parliament, or the owners who weren't paying their rent? Sir Charles Trevelyan, who was in charge of government aid efforts in Ireland during the famine, was in charge of this small British ministry. There was a lot of people starving because of Trevelyan's views, which seemed to include the idea that the famine was God's punishment for the Irish people and were based on the power of free enterprise. Putting him in charge was a death blow to Irish hope. British expansionism and Australia's Aboriginal peoples. Australia's native Aboriginal people were killed in large numbers many times. This is one of many dark tales in the history of the British Empire. King George III's country had a major problem that got worse when the British lost the American Revolution. The prisons were way too crowded, and the empire could no longer use the extra space that their former colony provided. Because of this, there was a mad rush to find another place where a lot of British prisoners could live. This was the start of empire expansionism in Australia, which was very bad for the continent's native Aboriginal people. The first people to live in the colonies came in January 1788, when Captain Arthur Phillip led a small fleet that brought the first prisoners. A few years later, large-scale killings of indigenous people began. British troops started the first wave of mass killings in 1794. Eventually, they had to depend on the combined and localized power of colonial settlers and regional police, who often had government support. Attacks like these on Aboriginal people went on without being punished by the law until the 1920s. At least 28 Wiriwiri people were killed in the Mile Creek Massacre in June 1838. It is famous because it was the only time British farmers were tried and found guilty of killing Aboriginal people. It is thought that more than 400 killings happened on the Australian colonial frontier between 1794 and 1928. During this time, over 10,000 Aboriginal people were killed in these planned and government-backed offensives alone. The British Empire's concentration camps during the Second Anglo-Boer War. During the Second Boer War in South Africa, the British Empire set up what some people call the first modern prison camps. During the war, which ran from 1899 to 1902, British troops used harsh tactics against guerrilla movements led by Boer people, who were descended from Dutch colonists. By 1900, Imperial troops had moved more than 200,000 civilians into camps. Most of them were women and children. Emily Hobhouse, an English anti-war activist, widely wrote about how horrible the camps were, with people going hungry and getting sick all the time. There are nearly 2,000 people in this one camp, over 900 children. Imagine the heat outside the tents and the suffocation inside. We sat on their khaki blankets, the sun blazed through the single canvas, and the flies lay thick and black on everything. No chair, no table, nor any room for such, per The Guardian. By the end of the war, at least 28,000 Boers had died in the camps, and most of them were children. A lot of information wasn't kept on the deaths of black prisoners who were held in different camps, but it's thought that over 20,000 died. The British Empire's forgotten role in the Opium Wars. In the 1800s, the Opium Wars showed how far the West, especially Great Britain, would go to protect trade that it saw as very important. The British Empire traded with China in the 1800s and made a lot of money from it. China sent many valuable things to Britain, like porcelain, silk, and tea. But when it came to their trade partner in the East, the Western power had two big problems. To begin, British ships could only go to Canton, which is now Guangzhou. Also, Chinese traders kept saying they weren't interested in British goods and only wanted silver in return. This caused a panic in the British Empire because it had to keep using its silver stocks. The reaction of the empire to this problem? Sneak Indian opium into China without permission and sell it for cash. China hasn't allowed opium since 1796. Years later, the number of people addicted to opium in the country hit scary levels. Every year, British drug smugglers brought more than 1,000 tons of the drug into China. China started 2 wars with Britain, and the US, Russia, and France joined the Second War. This was because China tried to stop illegal opium imports and put in place protections against them. Because of these wars, China would lose a lot of land, its reputation around the world, and power over its own markets. The Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. In April 1919, the British Empire did something horrible that changed the way it ruled India and set the country on the path to freedom. The Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, also called the Amritsar Massacre, happened when a group of Indian nationalists gathered at the Jallianwala Bagh Park in the holy city of Amritsar to protest British rule. They were angry about how the empire forced Indians to join the army and how much tax the people had to pay all the time. It's important to remember that a lot of people were also angry about the Rowlatt Act at this time. This law let the imperial government hold trials without judges and jail suspects without them first arguing their cases in court. Before the massacre, British Brigadier General Reginald Dyer took charge of Amritsar because of rising unrest in the Punjab area. During martial rule, people were not allowed to gather together freely. But on April 13, 1919, a lot of people came to the city for the Baisakhi festival, which is a traditional Sikh harvest celebration. They joined the protesters at Jallianwala Bagh. As a result, Dyer led his men to the park and surrounded it. They then started firing on the crowd of people who were not armed, doing so for over 1,600 rounds. After the fact, official British sources said that 379 people had died. A lot more people were hurt in the massacre, though, so the real number is probably higher. The Bengal famine of 1943. Over 3 million people died in eastern India during one of the worst famines in world history in 1943, while the world was in the middle of the terrible World War II. Unlike the Great Potato Famine in Ireland, the Bengal famine of 1943 was mostly thought to have been caused by economic and political issues. During the war, the British Empire had to send huge amounts of food, like rice, which became very valuable after the Japanese invasion of Burma, to different fronts. There was widespread fear, valuable exports were routinely sent to other countries, and the imperial government ignored repeated warnings that the situation in Bengal could lead to famine. All of these things made disaster more likely. Leo Amery, who was India's Secretary of State at the time, says that Winston Churchill's first response to the problem was a cold dismissal. The Prime Minister made it a point to blame the Indian people for breeding like rabbits. By the time more real efforts to help started to form at the end of 1943, the worst tragedy had already killed many people. In recent years, the terrible effects of the famine, which were once just a footnote in the history of World War II, have finally gotten the respect they deserve from scholars. Niratan Bedwa, a survivor of the famine, wrote about the terrible things families had to go through in an article released by the BBC. Mothers didn't have any breast milk. Their bodies had become all bones, no flesh, she explained. Many children died at birth, their mothers too. Even those that were born healthy died young from hunger. Lots of women killed themselves at that time. The bombing of Iraq in 1920. In 1920, there was a rising in Iraq. Over 100,000 Shia and Sunni people joined forces to fight against the British troops, who had been in Iraq since the end of World War I. The British may have thought they were freeing the Arabs from the rule of the Ottoman Empire, but the Iraqi people quickly became unhappy with having yet another foreign power ruling over every aspect of their lives. It was smart for insurgency groups, which included Kurdish fighters, to choose their targets: railway lines and remote empire military posts. Besides being religiously diverse, the revolts were also interesting because the Iraqi rebels seemed to come from all walks of life. It didn't matter if they were from the country or the city. The British had made most of the people very angry. The British used the uprising as a chance to show off the Royal Air Force's frightening power in a brutal way. The Guardian says that the RAF flew over 4,000 hours in Iraq in 1920 alone and dropped an amazing 100 tons of bombs, killing close to 9,000 Iraqis. For the next few years, the area would be controlled mostly by a steady stream of air raids, with RAF leaders focusing on villages with a wary eye. The partition of India. It's safe to say that the way the British handled the 1947 partition of India was one of the biggest and worst mistakes in modern geopolitics. After World War II, Great Britain seemed eager to start the process of decolonization. This meant that they dealt with the Hindu-Muslim conflict during India and Pakistan's freedom with a stark and hasty lack of care. The British, led by a British lawyer who had never been to India, divided India into arbitrary areas that split up families and split up Muslim and Hindu groups that were not all the same. In an interview with the Washington Post in 2017, Sarjit Singh Chaudhary, a Sikh soldier in the British Army who fought in Iraq and then helped Muslims escape to Pakistan, talked about how chaotic the subcontinent was right after the split. Chowdhury said, "When I had left, India was a peaceful country. When I came back, it was bloodshed. Just a few months after the split, the area fell into an unimaginable disaster. It seemed like overnight, nearly 20 million people started to migrate as they tried to escape to either side of the new borders. Blood trains, or trains full of dead passengers, became frequent. In the end, Britain's hasty departure from India led to a lot of burning, stealing, killing, and rape. There were a lot of changes after the split, and records show that at least 2 million people died." The British Terror in Kenya. Kenya was in a terrible war from 1952 to 1960. It was called the Mau Mau Revolt, but it was also called the Mau Mau Uprising and the Kenya Emergency. Mau Mau troops, mostly made up of Kikuyu people, fought against British rule in Kenya. In response, the British government did a lot of terrible things. The Kenya Human Rights Commission says that 90,000 Kenyans were killed or tortured during the war, and that another 160,000 were jailed in horrible conditions. For more information on what Britain did in Kenya, read Imperial Reckoning, The Untold Story of Britain's Gulag in Kenya, and Legacy of Violence, A History of the British Empire, both written by Caroline Elkins. These books show how the British Empire once again used camps to stop African resistance. During Imperial Reckoning, Elkins wrote that, "Only by detaining nearly the entire Kikuyu population of 1.5 million people and physically and psychologically atomizing its men, women, and children could colonial authority be restored and the civilizing mission reinstated." Even though British loyalists won the war, the violence that happened during it made it possible for Kenya to become fully independent in 1963. Even now, the British government is still being accused of a wide range of human rights violations, including torture, forced transfer, jail time without trial, and many other clear examples of gross abuse. It would be 50 years after the end of the Mau Mau uprising before the war in Kenya showed how far the empire would go to keep their secrets hidden. We hope you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.